This is a story written by Dennis's cousin, Malka Romanov, in 2006, The Discovery of Our Belgian Family. This is a story of how my brother and I learned of the existence of part of our family living in Belgium. It is a story of incredible coincidences. First, I have to start with a little family history. My father, Harry Raznick, was born in Mogilev, Belarus. He was the oldest of 8 children. After him were 6 sisters and a younger brother. They all immigrated to England with their mother. My mother, Sarah Lear, came from a small shtetl in Poland. My parents met in London and married. My brother Irving and I were born in London. We didn't know our father's family very well. The ones we knew best were his brother, our Uncle Lou, his wife Polly, and their 2 sons, Manny and Dennis. During the Second World War, my parents and I emigrated to America, where my mother's family lived in New York. After settling in America, our parents had very little contact with the family in London, and my brother and I even less. In time, Irving moved to Los Angeles, where he met and married Violet. I met and married Eli Romanov. We lived in various places and finally moved to Massachusetts. We were married for 52 years and Eli died in October 2005. The first incredible coincidence was in 1985 in Los Angeles, where Violet, my sister-in-law, was a substitute teacher in the LA school system. One day, she went to substitute in a class of small children. She wrote her name on the blackboard. During the recess, she was approached by a young woman, Louise, who was working as her aide. In a strong English accent, she said the name that Violet had written on the blackboard, Raznick, was her name too. Violet asked where she was from, and Louise said she was from London. When Violet said that her husband was also from London, they discovered that Louise is the daughter of our cousin Dennis, the son of our Uncle Lou and Aunt Polly. Thus, Irving was reunited with our cousin. In 1989, Eli and I went to the wedding of Irving and Vi's son, Stephen. It so happened that Dennis and his wife were visiting their daughter Louise at that time. We spent an enjoyable reunion with Dennis, whom I had not seen for 49 years, and I met his wife Sheila. Eli and I enjoyed being with them, and we exchanged addresses. We communicated with them mostly by exchanging New Year cards. On 2 occasions, Eli and I met them in London for a few hours on our way to Israel. This was our only contact with them until after Eli died. Sheila and Dennis moved to LA permanently a few years ago. Irving and the family wanted me to visit them after Eli died. After Shloshim, I planned to visit for a couple of weeks and wrote to Dennis and Sheila saying I'd be in LA and asked if they would like to see me. They responded immediately saying they very much wanted to see me, and a few days after I arrived in LA, I visited them in their home. We were sitting drinking tea when Sheila suddenly asked me if I knew the secret in my father's family. I said I didn't know of any secret. She then asked me if I knew that my father had been married before he married my mother. This was an enormous shock. I never ever saw anything unusual in our home, not a picture, not a written word or spoken that would make me question anything. When I caught my breath, I asked if there'd been any of these children from the first marriage. Yes, there were 4 daughters. This was an even greater shock. Not in my wildest dreams could I imagine I had 4 half-sisters. I'd always wanted a sister and was ecstatic that I had 4. This quickly turned to disappointment that only one was still alive, and she was 96 years old and in a nursing home and no longer lucid. Now I felt really cheated. I asked Sheila and Dennis how they knew this story, while it was certainly new to Irving and me. Sheila then revealed to me the whole story. My father was married to a woman named Zelda, and they had 4 daughters. After the First World War, she left my father and went to Belgium with Jack, the husband of one of my father's 6 sisters. This was an enormous scandal, especially when viewed in the societal values of the 1920s. Jack and Zelda took the 4 girls, my half-sisters, and settled in Charleroi, a town southeast of Brussels. Jack left his wife, my father's sister Frida, and 5 children in London. Thus, 2 fathers abandoned 9 children. The girls, my half-sisters, always missed their father and never ever considered Jack in that role. Our father never visited them in Belgium or ever saw them again. Sheila believes that the family in London knew that Jack and Zelda had moved to Belgium, but that only 2 of Jack's daughters visited them in the 1920s before their marriage. I believe there must be much more to this part of the story, but there's no way in which we can find out, because that generation, none of that generation is still alive. Why did my parents never tell us about our half-sisters? Why was there no contact with the girls? Was there any attempt to contact them after the war? The next amazing coincidence took place a year or so after the end of World War II, when an American soldier found himself in the town of Charleroi. He was alone and didn't know any French. He went to services at the local synagogue in the hope of meeting fellow Jews. After the service, there was a kiddush in the basement. He was seated opposite 2 women who were speaking English with an English accent. He said to them, "Oh, it's so good to hear English." They said, "We're from London. Where are you from?" He said he was from the United States, but he'd just come from London. They asked him what he had been doing there. He said he'd been visiting his Uncle Lou and Auntie Polly. They stared at him and said, "We have an Uncle Lou and Auntie Polly in London." It turned out that while the 2 women, my half-sisters, were related to Lou, their father's brother, this soldier was related to Polly, Lou's wife. They welcomed him into their home, and there he learned about the family. They had suffered a lot during the war. When Belgium was invaded by the Germans, who took their mother Zelda, my father's first wife, Jack, the man whom she left England with, Harriet, the younger daughter of Zelda and Jack, one of my sisters, Esther, and the husband of another sister, 5 members in one family, and they all perished in the concentration camps. The soldier returned to London and told Lou and Polly that he had met the Belgian family. My cousin Dennis was in the Royal Air Force stationed in Lille, and at the first opportunity he went to Belgium to meet the family. When he entered their home, he saw a picture of my father, his Uncle Harris, on the wall. Thus contact was established between Lou, Polly, Dennis and Sheila and my father's remaining 3 daughters and their families. There was visiting back and forth. When 2 of the sisters were in Lou and Polly's home, they told Sheila and Dennis that they knew that their father had remarried and had 2 children, and they went to America during the war. They asked that if Sheila and Dennis ever happened to meet us, not to tell us about them. It was easy for them to promise not to tell us because they never thought they would ever meet us until the coincidence of Violet and Louise meeting in Los Angeles. This promise was the reason they never told us about our father's first families when they met us in Los Angeles and in London. When they first met me, Sheila and Dennis telephoned the sisters in Belgium asking to be released from their promise. The sisters refused. Actually, Irvin, Violet and their sons did briefly meet them when on a visit to London in 1970, but they never stayed in contact. As for the reason for secrecy, from subsequent conversations with the sisters, Sheila and Dennis understood that they were ashamed because their mother and Jack never married. They told me that they wanted to tell the story because we had the right to know, but they felt bound by their promise not to tell us. After Eli died, and I told Sheila and Dennis that I would be in LA, they decided it would be the right opportunity to tell me. My oldest sister, who was still alive at the time, was the only one left of that generation. She died a few weeks after I returned to Massachusetts. Sheila was kind enough to draw a tree of my father's family in London. Although I remembered that my father had had several sisters, I never knew there were 6 of them. I do remember meeting 1 or 2 and a couple of cousins. Sheila also drew a tree of the family in Belgium. It's not a very large family because the 3 sisters who survived the war had only 4 children among them. I told Sheila I would like to be in touch with the family in Belgium. She said she would very much like for us to know each other since she thought we would get along well, and in fact had wanted us to meet them for a long time. She told me she was in contact with Ariel, one of the granddaughters of my oldest sister, the one who was still alive at that time. She knows English well. First, Sheila had to tell Ariel the whole story she had told me, since they were unaware of our existence, and to tell her that I would like to be in touch with her. She did so, and Ariel replied immediately that of course Sheila should give me her email address. Ariel wrote that we are part of the family, and that it was a shame that her sister never talked about this part of the family history, and they never wanted to meet Irvin and me. Ariel and I began communicating. We each wrote about our families, and gradually we learned about each other's lives. We exchanged photographs, and for the first time I saw pictures of my half-sisters. I wish I could have known them. Ariel requested pictures of my father when he was old, since they only have pictures of him when he was young. She expressed the desire to meet me, and I in turn wanted to meet them. After Eli died, I promised to visit his family in Israel, and also my family, part of my mother's family from Argentina, who had immigrated to Israel. Eli and I had been very close to both families for many years. I arranged to meet in Israel in the spring and asked Ariel if the family in Belgium would like me to visit them during my trip. Ariel answered enthusiastically. I planned to be in Israel for 6 weeks, enough time to see people at their convenience, and during that time I took a side trip to Belgium for 3 days. I didn't know what to expect because I didn't know them and they didn't know me, so I decided the trip should be short. I needn't have worried. They welcomed me with all their hearts, and I spent 3 very full, wonderful days and learned a lot. I spent the better part of the last year organising Eli's study and converting it into a guest room. Now I look forward to accommodating my relatives from Belgium comfortably. Meantime, I hope to visit the family in Belgium again soon. In addition to the enrichment I feel in meeting the Belgian family, I have another reason to appreciate learning about them at this time. The story was made known to me only 5 weeks after Eli died. Instinctively, I wanted to rush to him and say, "Guess what, Eli? I have a family in Belgium." I know he would have been thrilled. We'd been married for 52 years, and it was and still is a difficult time for my children and me. The story of the discovery of the Belgian family was a welcome distraction. I correspond with them and they want me to visit again. I also want them to meet Daphne and David because they're anxious to meet them. I hope that putting this story in writing will encourage them, my grandchildren and Irving's children, Stephen and David, and his family, his grandchildren, to know their family in Belgium. About incredible coincidences. If Violet and Louise had not met in Los Angeles, and what are the chances that such a meeting could take place in a city the size of LA? If Eli and I had not happened to be in LA when Sheila and Dennis were visiting their daughter and met them, and stayed in contact through correspondence and meeting them twice in London, if the American soldier had not met 2 of my sisters in the shul in Shalwa, which is truly an amazing coincidence, and if I had not happened to visit Irving and his family in LA after Eli died and contacted Dennis and Sheila, who revealed the family secret to me, the family here would not know about our Belgian family. How many other coincidences are there that fly in the face of credibility?